Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for stopping by today. In this video, I just got these snowman dies and I just felt like playing with them, but I wanted to create a different background than what I normally do. So I decided to play an experiment with embossing acetate. So I have my 3D embossing folder here. I put the acetate in the folder and I'm running it back and forth a couple times. Typically, if I'm using paper in my 3D embossing folders, I will mist them with water to help that go into all of the grooves of the 3D folder, but because you can't do that with acetate, I wanted to go back and forth several times just to make sure to get that texture in there. Now you could leave the texture as is, but I wanted to have a little bit of sparkle in there. So I'm using the glimmer paste and I'm just going to use a palette knife and push it into all of the grooves of that 3D folder. Now my piece of acetate here is larger than I actually need it to be for the card. So I'm going to do the entire piece and then I will cut it down and glue it onto a piece of cardstock. Now while I'm putting this on with the palette knife, like I said, I'm just pushing it into all of those grooves. So I'm making it even on the top and putting it into the groove. So I've got some thicker areas and thinner areas. And this is what it looks like after it has dried. Now the acetate piece that I chose was really quite heavy. So there's a lot of texture in this piece here. So I wanted to glue it down to some cardstock and then glue it to a card base just to see if it would lay somewhat flat in order to create a card over top of it. If I were to do this again, I would choose a piece of acetate that was a little bit thinner, that had a little bit more flexibility to it so that it would be a little bit easier to get it flat. It does lie fairly flat for the card because I have a fairly heavy card base. The cardstock that I'm using for the card base is Nina Classic Crest 110 pound. And I will list and link everything that I'm using down in the description below. So you can see even after putting it on the cardstock, there's still a little bit of curve to that piece there. So I'm cutting it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 and I'm going to glue it onto the front of my card base. Once again, just to see if I can get it to lay pretty flat in order to create a card out of it. If it's not going to lay flat, there's no point in continuing and adding different layers on there. So this is just kind of a test just to see how flat I could do it with. Like I said, to do it again, I would choose a piece of acetate that was a little bit thinner because I love the look of it, but it is a little bit thick. I do get it to lay fairly flat for the card, but it is fairly thick. While these pieces are drying, I like to put an acrylic block on them, and then I have a jar that's got some heavy beads in it to keep it really, really flat while it's drying. So this is how it looks just as the background here, and I think it would even be pretty just to add a couple snowflakes and a sentiment here. But like I said, I just got this snowman die set and I really, really wanted to use it, so we're going to continue on. So I have all my pieces laid out how I want them, and off screen I did the die cutting with the different colors that I wanted to use and whatnot. So this particular die set has a solid piece and a piece that has the details cut out of it. The solid piece is black and the details on the front that are cut out of it are the little buttons and the little eyes. So the nice thing is you don't have a bunch of teeny tiny pieces to place on here. You can just put that solid white piece on the black back piece and you get those details in there. So while these things are drying, I also like to put my acrylic blocks on them so that I continue on assembling other pieces and don't have to hold things to dry them in place. I'm using Distress Collage medium because it dries clear and it dries matte. So if anything happens to squeeze out, you won't even be able to see it, but it dries fairly quickly. And the nice thing with liquid glue is you can shimmy things into place while you're placing them so that you don't have to get perfect placement every time. I do prefer to use a liquid glue for this, especially when you're putting a bunch of die cuts together and assembling little pieces like this. These dies here have different layers on top of other layers. You could cut them in different colors of cardstock. I chose to cut them in the same color cardstock, and then I'm going to use some Copics later to add a little bit of dimension to them and a little bit of different color. Like I said, you could use it to cut different colors to begin with and not have to do that step. The nice thing about dies like this is you can use lots of scrap cardstocks that you have. As a card maker, paper crafter, we accumulate them so easily and they can kind of get out of control. So it's nice to have little projects that we can use to use up some of those little cardstock bits. This is one of those projects that I would likely sit and make a bunch of snowmen to have on hand for other projects. This particular one being my first one, I did them from start to finish, but it would be a great rainy day project to just put a movie on, die cut a bunch of pieces and assemble a bunch of pieces just to have them ready to go for when you do want to get creative. So for one of the scarves and hats, what I'm going to do to glue it together is I'm going to use stickles. Now stickles is a glitter glue, but it is also a glue. So because there's some open areas in these die cuts, you're going to see the stickles through there, but it will glue the other parts of the die cut together. Just a different way to add a little bit of extra sparkle to it and do it all in one step. Now, because that stickles is in the open area of the die cut, I'm not going to put an acrylic block on there because I don't want that glitter glue to be sticking to the acrylic block while it dries. And those pieces are small enough that they're not going to curve or bend, and they don't really need to be held in place. So it's going to add a really nice goldish colored sparkle to the open pieces of that die cut. I love that this particular set also gives you the option of having the snowman facing different ways, as in the bases are exactly the same, but you'll have a couple options for the top layer to have them facing different ways. The other thing that they do great with this is the arm dies and the nose dies cut multiples at once. So you can cut a bunch of them and then just keep them with your die set, have them ready for the next time you want to make a snowman. You've got some pre-cut already. So my scarf there, my red scarf and my red hat have already dried. So I'm just taking a darker red Copic marker and I'm coloring it on top of there. If you wanted to color it a completely different color, you could take something like a Posca pen or a paint pen and use that to color it a different color. But because the background of this card is so busy and sparkly, I didn't really want to have a lot of extra colors in the snowmen and their accessories. So I'm trying to keep them somewhat simple and not compete with the background of the card. Once I have all of the pieces ready to go, I can start assembling them onto the front of the card. Now, when I first thought of this card, this is kind of how I was thinking I was going to do it. But once I put that Winter Wishes part that comes with this die set, I realized how wide it was, how long it was, and that it wasn't going to fit within the width of my card nicely. And I really didn't want to cut it down. So rather than changing everything up, I just decided to change the layout and put it this way on the card. And it works much better for that particular sign. The cool thing about that sign is there's one die that cuts a solid, and then there's another die that cuts those words. So you can choose to cut a solid sign and have something different on it using different letter dies or even a stamp or whatnot. So it's great to have that versatility in that. So I'll be gluing the different pieces onto this card in stages. Because a lot of those pieces are going to be glued onto that acetate, and because the acetate isn't porous, it's really only going to be drying from one side. So by adding them a little bit at a time and letting it dry in between, it's just going to make it a little bit easier. And you may have seen when I flipped those snowmen over to put glue on there, there's some white stamping on them. This is a piece of cardstock that I had stamped something. I was trying a different technique and it wasn't working. So I just put it back in my scraps. There's no point in throwing it away. Might as well use it for a different technique. And had you not seen the back of that piece there, you never would have known it was there. So some of these pieces from this set are easy enough to use and to handle with your fingers, but if some of the pieces get a little bit small, and you'll notice as the pieces get tinier, I'll pull in some tweezers. It just makes it easier to hold them and to place them, as well as to add glue to the back of them. So don't be afraid to grab some tweezers if it just helps you place things a little bit better. So for right now, I'm adding the scarves and the hats as well as the noses, and then I will let things dry a little bit before I attempt to add the sign and the arms. Just because you'll notice as I'm placing even the scarf and the hat, the snowmen are moving on that background because they're not dried yet from the liquid glue. So much easier to have things in place, let them dry, and have things secure while you're adding even more details. And you'll also notice that for the noses, I do grab those tweezers. So I grab a pair of tweezers that you have to press them in order to open the tweezers. That's the easiest way to do this. The first tweezers I grabbed were ones that you hold closed, and this is just easier. These ones that it automatically holds it and you just press it or squeeze it in order to let the pieces go will work a lot better for this particular technique. Now, I've used plain cardstock for all of this. Like I said, I didn't want to compete with the background because it was busy and sparkly enough. But if you had a more solid plain background, you could easily use metallic paper, glitter paper, and that sort of thing to die cut for some of these, the different elements for the snowmen. I kind of thought it looked like they were floating in air and I wanted them to have something to sit on. So I grabbed a scrap of white cardstock and I like to just rip it to create kind of natural looking hills when I do this. You could, if you preferred to have a more solid edge, you could easily cut it. It's very easy to do, but my personal preference is just ripping it and having that torn edge as the top of the hill. And I typically like to use both pieces when I rip it. And you'll notice my cardstock here is longer than the width of the card, but I'm gonna let that dry for a while and then I will just take some scissors and I will trim those end pieces off. I do have the edge, the bottom edge of that cardstock is in line with the bottom edge of my card. So it's just gonna be a matter of trimming these sides off. So now with the snowman and the bottom snow secure, we can start adding the sign as well as the snowman arms. And I thought the sign would look a little bit better with a little bit of shading around the outside edges. So I just have a jumbo topper here and a brown ink, and I'm just adding a little bit of brown towards the outside edges of that piece of cardstock, and it just adds a little bit of shadow and dimension. This is not a necessary step. It's a personal preference thing. And really, had I thought about it ahead of time, what I would have done is taken the new Lost Shadow Distress ink and inked around the edge of my snowman. I think that would have been really, really a nice color for them and would have added some dimension to them as well. But because they're already glued down, we can't change that. So that's okay. It's one of those things that I will try it with one of the next times that I use this particular die set. So I just have my sign placed and I was going to start gluing the arms, but then realized I should actually glue the sign down securely so that I can just place the arms where those, around where that sign is. So you'll see I put some glue on one of the arms and then I just set it to the side while I glue the sign down. Because I have that arm in tweezers that squeeze to open up, it's really easy to go back and pick them up and to put that arm in place. And you'll also may have noticed that I took some scissors and I just snipped the arm length down. These ones are really quite long, and for this particular card it looked a little odd. So there's no reason why you can't shorten and customize your die cuts to work for what it is that you're working on. There may be another time that I use this die that the length of the arms as they come is going to be absolutely perfect. So it's great when you can customize them and shorten them to suit what it is that you're doing. So I've got the arms on the snowman on the left already done. I'll be adding them to the snowman on the right. And as I do it, I kind of realized that his left arm isn't actually visible. It would be totally behind the sign, so there's not really any point in putting it there. I kind of played with the idea of having a hand come up from the bottom and wrapping around the sign, but I also kind of thought it might look a little bit odd. So easy enough to just not put it on there at all. Now, because this die cuts several of each of the arms and several of each of the noses, I just put them in a little Ziploc bag with my dies so that next time I'm creating some of these snowmen, I have them already there, I have them pre-cut, and I don't have to try find where I've put them. This particular die set also has a few snowflakes, so I'm just going to glue those onto the background. Typically when I have a plain background and I have snowflake dies, I'll put some stickles or something sparkly on top of that, and I chose not to do that with this one just because there's already a lot of sparkle on that background and it really didn't need more. I thought it would kind of take away from the card. And I thought that those snowflakes would probably be seen less if I put some stickles on there. So I just left them the plain white cardstock and they looked really, really cute. Once I have those pieces on there, once again, put the acrylic block on there and set everything down to dry. The last thing I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to add a little bit of stickles on top of those torn edges from the paper for the little drifts of snow on the bottom. I just like to highlight them because the torn edges sometimes look a little bit boring and a little bit plain. And the stickles on the bottom of the snow just kind of plays off of the stickles that, or the glimmer paste that is behind the background, the acetate. So just a little bit on those torn edges, just to kind of add a little bit of sparkle to the bottom of the card and kind of tie everything in together. So I will let that completely dry. I added a little bit to the puffball on the red cap as well as the trim of there. But it was one of those things that once I did it, it didn't really need it, but it's there anyways. So once you have your stickles down, let that dry completely before you do anything with your card. And this is the result. I think it turned out really, really cute and so dimensional. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fabulous day.